Welcome to Nonfiction Literature, our second genre in 1302. Now, what is nonfiction literature? Nonfiction literature or literary fiction is generally defined as any writing with a commitment to truth that has been written with specific attention to the craft of writing, using literary techniques to talk about subjects that are not made up. Oftentimes, people associate nonfiction with a more boring or informative type of literature, but in actuality, nonfiction literature can be very similar to fiction. The only difference is that it is tended to be true instead of made up. This might include essays, letters, speeches, opinion editorials, pamphlets. Any form of nonfiction aside from technical and academic writing can be considered literature. So there is a difference between your standard nonfiction writing and what's considered nonfiction literature, but just like with fiction, the distinction between literature and more typical types of writing is that literature is created with artistic intent. Now, our qualities that define nonfiction literature are two things. Number one, does the writer intend it as truth? Do they intend to communicate a story truthfully without any imagined elements? So, for example, in The Yellow Wallpaper, Charlotte Perkins Gilman went through a very similar experience to that. However, she did not intend Jane's story as truth, so it qualifies as fiction. But stories or writing that is intended as truth can qualify under nonfiction writing if the audience also accepts it as truth. So those are the two qualifications. Does the writer intend it to be true, and does the audience accept it to be true? Now, nonfiction literature gives us insight into the actual real lives of those who we are intended to empathize with. All literature is an act of empathy, and nonfiction literature specifically allows us to empathize with real situations and real people. And sometimes this is through, very similar styles of writing as fiction, and sometimes it's through different styles. But in actuality, nonfiction literature allows us perhaps an even more intimate ability to empathize with others. It also gives us perspective on how people communicate about ideas and issues in a way that deepens our understanding about them. A lot of these nonfiction pieces are writing about issues and ideas that are very relevant to the real world. And these are giving us insight into the way people make claims, to the way people share their opinions, share their ideas about the things that matter to them. Now, terms that you want to be familiar with in nonfiction include form and audience. So when we talk about form in nonfiction, we're talking about what type of text it is. So this could be a letter, it could be a speech, it could be an essay, and all of these are intended with different intent, and you want to keep this in mind as we're analyzing nonfiction. You also want to keep in mind what sort of audience it was intended for. Fiction is always intended for the same audience. It is always intended for a sort of public general audience because it is produced with the intent of being read by a wide audience. However, nonfiction is quite different. It can be produced for a public audience, similar to fiction, so written for general consumption. These are published texts, published pieces. It can also be written for a restricted audience, so written directly to someone as a private exchange. So personal letters or privately exchanged documents. As an example, Thomas Jefferson, very famous name in the American canon. He famously wrote some of our founding documents, some of our most, Americanized patriotic documents at the founding of the country that were intended for a public audience. But he also wrote a lot of documents for a restricted audience where we see a completely different side of him. We see a very sort of flirtatious and sort of playful side of him when he's writing private letters to a restricted audience. And this is why audience is important to keep in mind. The persona that a writer puts on for a public audience is going to be different than one they put on for a restricted audience. And it's also going to be different than a piece of writing that is for no audience. So these are private texts that were not intended to be read, but are. Anne Frank's diary is a famous example of a piece of writing that was not intended to be read, and we need to keep that in mind as we're analyzing that as a piece of nonfiction. Nonfiction also carries a purpose that's important to keep in mind. Nonfiction literature is designed to communicate something. What does the writer hope to accomplish with the text? And sometimes this is a overt argument. Sometimes this is a more creative, artistic argument. And sometimes it's just they want to call attention to something in a similar way to fiction. But most nonfiction has an idea or point that the writer wants to make, an argument of sorts. And depending on form and audience, this may be explicitly direct and stated. It can also be implicit and interpretive, similar to fiction. So we will read women's speeches in the first week of nonfiction. You're getting ready to read Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony and hear performances of their speech. And their purpose is very overt. They are not shy about what it is that they are intending to argue for. However, when we get into Kurt Vonnegut's letters or 9/11 speeches or other pieces of nonfiction, the argument might be a little bit more subtle. And these are things to pay attention to. In nonfiction, we care about both determining the intended purpose. What is it they want to accomplish? But many times what's much more important is evaluating the success of that purpose and considering how they achieve that purpose. So in analyzing nonfiction, we are not just concerned with figuring out what the point is, what they're trying to do. Oftentimes they will tell us directly. We are also heavily concerned with how the writer makes that point, what sort of appeals and what sort of emotion and what sort of techniques they use to make that point. And for this, we consider rhetoric. So rhetoric is a study in how we use language to communicate and create meaning. When we refer to rhetoric, we're looking at the choices a writer makes in crafting their text to achieve an effect. Nonfiction literature uses rhetorical appeals to create meaning. Rather than use the tools of fiction, things like character and plot and symbolism, nonfiction literature uses rhetoric as its elements that create meaning and create its artfulness. So does the writer use emotional imagery to stir their reader's emotion? Do they use authoritative and well-known sources to convince their audience? Do they practice ironclad logic? These are the sorts of questions that we're looking for as we look at rhetoric. So as a reminder of your rhetorical appeals, we have three major rhetorical appeals that we're looking for in rhetoric. The first of which is what's called ethos. Ethos comes from the Greek word for ethics. This is an appeal to the authority or credibility of a person. So for example, if a writer is evoking the Constitution, that is a very authoritative, credible document in American nonfiction. That would be an appeal to ethos. Some writers will have built-in ethos. For example, Martin Luther King. He is a very credible, authoritative figure at the time that he is writing, and that's going to carry a certain rhetorical weight to the way that he would make arguments in nonfiction writing. You also have an appeal to pathos. So pathos is an appeal to an emotion. This comes from the Greek word for pathetic. And we often think of pathetic as sort of an insult, but pathetic actually just means emotional. So appeal to pathos is an appeal to an emotion. So somebody trying to stir the audience's feelings, are they trying to evoke a certain emotion or a certain emotional reaction from their audience? This is something to pay attention to, particularly in your first two speeches of the week from Sojourner Truth. The pathetic appeal or the appeal to pathos in both of those is very interesting. And then we also look at logos. Logos comes from the word logic. This is an appeal to logic. This is using a clear logical chain or structure to create these arguments. And oftentimes arguments are going to have all three of these. And your task is to sort of figure out which of these arguments is the most dominant, which is the most effective. How are they using these different appeals in conjunction with each other to make their point? These are the questions that we're asking in nonfiction. You also want to be aware of context and exigence. So in nonfiction, context is a series of circumstances that surround a piece's writing. These are the circumstances going on in the world and whatever sort of issue the writer might be talking about. Those are important to know to understand their purpose and the rhetorical appeals they use to make their purpose. And you also want to be thinking about exigence. Exigence is the event or circumstance that caused the writer to write. It is whatever prompts them to complete their writing. And that might be in response to another person. That might be an event in the world. But these things are very important to understand what the writer is doing in a piece of nonfiction. So, a nonfiction text exigence is often another idea, text, or issue that directly prompted them to write, and a nonfiction text can often become exigence for another nonfiction text to respond to it. So, understanding what prompts a writer to write through these exigent circumstances is essential. The exigence of your first set of speeches comes from the women's suffrage movement, and this is important for you to understand. So let's get into the speeches that you are going to read in this first week of nonfiction. So we discussed the social context of women's roles in the 19th century and the growing movement for voting rights, which are a part of what prompted both women to write to these pieces of nonfiction. Now, these are in fact speeches, so they are delivered in an oral format. The first that you are going to read, you're going to read two versions of Sojourner Truth's Anti Woman. In 1851, Sojourner Truth attended a women's convention in Akron, Ohio. And you are going to learn more about Sojourner Truth and her electrifying speeches in her bio video coming up. But her speech was an impromptu response to a group of clergy who were against the ideas of the convention. Sojourner Truth was born as an enslaved person, and she never learned to read or write, but her speeches were recorded on 2 different occasions. So we have 2 versions of this speech, which were transcribed by 2 different individuals. The first is the 1851 Robinson version, which was published days after Truth's speech by her friend Marius Robinson in the Anti-Slavery Bugle. And this is what is considered to be the more accurate version of the speech. This is more true to Truth's actual delivery. And then we have the 1863 Gage version, which was published by a white woman over a decade after the speech during the Civil War. So you want to consider the different context surrounding the 2 speeches. In the first version, Truth attended this convention where a group of clergy were sort of antagonizing her, and she got up and spoke in a sort of passionate response off the cuff. And then, over a decade later, you have the Gage version, which takes Truth's speech and manipulates it to serve a different purpose with a different rhetorical mode during the Civil War. And then the third speech that you're reading is from Susan B. Anthony, who is probably the most known name within the women's suffrage movement. Her speech was in response to her own arrest. She voted in an election, and she was federally charged for it because it was illegal for women to vote. She gave her speech during her trial, not in her trial because women couldn't testify, but as a press release during her trial. She then continued to refine it and deliver it in counties across the state. So her speech is much more polished and prepared. However, the rhetorical appeals and the rhetorical situation are different, and these are things to be considering. Finally, nonfiction writing exists as a conversation. People respond to, expand upon, and challenge each other. And that doesn't mean that Truth and Anthony are directly responding to each other. In fact, they are not. They're writing decades apart. But what is going on at the time and the context and the exigence that surrounds these things, these are all part of a larger conversation about women and women's rights. And these rhetorical considerations are important to keep in mind as you get started with your first nonfiction texts.